I want to make sure that 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 a person listening to this conversation, let's say, who is suffering, that this ends up being helpful because, it is crucial to understand the lack of like construct validity, as we might call it, in all of these diagnoses and the problems that a diagnosis can bring about. But let's say, if we were to refrain from categorizing an individual's suffering in terms of DSM classifications, but if we were to acknowledge this person is suffering intensely with tremendous anxiety and or depression, etc., you talk about, your approach. So I'd like to read what you wrote were the five principles that guide your practice, and I would love to hear you expound upon them. Number one is deconstructing the diagnosis. Number two, understanding the relevance of psychological injury, which is a phrase you like, in place of trauma, which is a term that's, I agree, has become popularized. And yeah, it's just the waters are a little muddy around what trauma really is in this case. So yeah, understanding the relevance of psychological injury, working on therapeutic relationships, awareness of culture and context, and then awareness of the way that the problem can become the problem, and that once a problem is established, sometimes it perpetuates itself, like your insomnia example that you were mentioning earlier. So you wrote those as like the five kind of bullet point principles that guide your practice. And I would just love to hear more about just the way you practice, the way, your perceptual set around working with people.
Yeah, I think, like I said earlier, I always start from the principle that people are trying to do the best that they can in the situation they found themselves in. So I always start from the position of being non-judgmental, and I think of what they're experiencing as being part of what I consider to be ordinary and or understandable human experiences. In terms of the literature, the only thing that I think we can say with any certainty is that there is a strong association between adverse experiences of a variety of types and the likelihood of having a psychiatric or psychological presentation. It's not a one-to-one, but it just increases, and particularly if it happens when you're younger. And I prefer the word psychological injury because what hurts somebody can be very different depending on your history, your cultural background, than what hurts somebody else. And I also kind of found the idea of trauma quite difficult to talk in those terms, because I think young people who've grown up with things that have been unpleasant, difficult, they often don't think of it in terms of trauma. That might be a word we put on it, because it was their normal. They didn't have anything else to. So that's one of the reasons some of the reasons I tend to talk in terms of psychological injury. It's just the idea that you've been hurt, that was painful, that was unpleasant, that was difficult. And I can understand why you might be reacting this way all these years later. You still expect things to be, you're trying to protect yourself from things being hurt again, whatever. And also with parents, one of the things that because a lot of my work involves working with the family system. I think people have a context. So I think of the context as their support network. They can often do a lot more than they believe they can do. Parents may come expecting that we have the answer and the specific intervention, but actually that's quite disempowering. So a lot of the time it's trying to help parents see how important they are and how much they can influence, and maybe just also to be a bit more patient sometimes about what they expect or when they expect it, or there's all sorts of things. So I see that kind of system that people are part of as a strength, as a resource, as something to build on with them. And also they can be really important in helping to demedicalize or depathologize the story that so you can talk to the young person, but if you talk to the young person and their parents, help them understand, for example, that the voices that the young person is hearing is not the main problem. The main problem is your interpretation of the voices and the fact that you want them to go away. And if they don't go away, that makes you feel even more hopeless. But what if the aim of our therapeutic intervention is not about how they go away, but how you engage with them, how you understand them, how you live with them, what they can teach you, and parents often get that. So working with parents is, and we're very, we don't do culture well at all. We don't recognize, for example, that what we call psychiatry and psychology is the product of a culture in itself. It is a particular way of thinking about the nature of human functioning. My background is that my father's Iraqi and my mother's English, so I speak Arabic. And I've had these discussions with my father when I'd written a number of papers for the Arab Journal of Psychiatry, and we had to translate the abstract. You can write it in Arabic or you can write it in English as long as you have an abstract in the other language. But I fell down on the first article that I did, almost the first word, because there actually isn't an equivalent word for mental in Arabic. There's a choice of 3 different words. And their roots are interesting. For example, the word we settled on is a word called nefsiya, and it kind of refers to a kind of soul. So talk about amrad nefsiya. It's like illnesses of the soul. And even the word nefsiya is interesting because its root is in the word tanafus. Tanafus is breathing. So there's already a connection between breath and the idea of soul and the idea of mental functioning. So, and there's many other examples like that you can see that the language holds clues as to how culturally you construct our idea of what subjective life is differently. And we seem to have very little awareness of the different ways we can construct our sense of mental functioning, our understanding of relationships, and our understanding of our relationship to the broader world.